Today we'll talk about the most important organ of the body, which is the brain. Human brain is the most powerful and most complex structure of the body. You know that central nervous system, or CNS, consists of a brain and the spinal cord. Spinal cord and brain, those are the two parts or organs of the central nervous system. So today we'll talk about the brain. Since your brain is the most important organ of the body, your brain is protected heavily. A number of structures protect your brain. So we'll see the structures protect the brain. Then we'll talk about the cavities inside the brain called the ventricles. And the ventricles, those cavities contain the cerebrospinal fluid. Then we'll talk about the parts of the brain, surface marking, lobes. Then we'll talk about the white matter and gray matter. We talked about these two structures in my last lecture. We'll talk about important functional areas in the cerebral cortex. And then we'll talk about the map of the body in your motor and sensory parts or cortices of the brain. Those are called homunculi. First, since your brain must be protected heavily, we'll see that the structures that protect the brain. So this is the brain. You know that brain is located inside the cranial cavity formed by the cranial bones. So the cranial bones form the cranial cavity, and inside that cavity you have the brain. So this is the bone, cranial bone, okay, and then outside of the bone you have the skin. So the skin of the head is called the scalp. So first outermost structure is the scalp, okay, thick skin that covers the bones. Then you have the cranial bones, and under the cranial bone you have a thick connective tissue membrane. This is called the dura mater. And then under the dura mater you have another layer of connective tissue that is called the arachnoid matter. So this is the second layer under the dura mater, and that is called the arachnoid matter. Okay, arachnoid matter. And then there is another thin layer that covers the surface of the brain, attached to the surface of the brain, difficult to separate from the brain, and that thin layer is the innermost membrane, and that is called the pia mater. Okay, so three layers: dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. These three membranes together is called the meninges. Okay, so meninges has three layers. Outermost dura is very tough, and this is the toughest and strongest as well as the thickest layer. Then arachnoid mater has some finger-like structures, extensions called the arachnoid villi, and arachnoid villi absorbs the cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, the fluid in the brain, is absorbed by this villi. Then you have the thin layer directly attached to the surface of the brain, that is the pia mater. Okay. So those are the structures protect your brain. Now under the dura mater you have blood vessels. Okay, and under the arachnoid mater, in subarachnoid space, you have the cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid around the brain. So that is another protection. Since brain is very delicate, sensitive organ, you see in subarachnoid space, that means between arachnoid and pia mater, you have a fluid. That fluid is surrounding the brain. So cerebrospinal fluid where in subarachnoid. Sub means under the arachnoid matter. Okay. And the space between the skull, the cranial bone, and the dura mater, that is, you see this space, this is called epidural. So outside of the dura mater, between the bone and the dura, epidural space. Makes sense. And under the dura, between dura and arachnoid, this space is called subdural space. So epidural space outside of the dura, subdural space under the dura, and subarachnoid space under the arachnoid. So those are three spaces important. This one, and this one. Now, if any injury occurs from outside, what can happen if the blood vessel ruptures, then blood can accumulate, see, in epidural space or in subdural space. And if blood accumulates in epidural space, that is called epidural hematoma. Accumulation of blood. If in subdural space, that is called subdural hematoma. So subdural hematoma, epidural hematoma. A clinical condition or disease of the meninges, probably many of you have heard, that is called meningitis. Inflammation of the meninges, covering of the brain and the spinal cord. Meninges also covers the spinal cord, not only the brain. So if that covering of the brain and the meninges are inflamed, that could be bacterial or viral inflammation due to bacterial or viral infection, usually causes meningitis. Okay, so the person will have severe headache and stiffness of the muscles of the face and the neck and shoulder areas, fever. Now any brain disorder as a whole is termed as encephalopathy. Any brain disease that can change the function or structure or structural change occurs in the brain. Okay, encephalopathy. And another term that is called encephalitis. Itis is inflammation, right? So inflammation of the brain tissue. Brain inflammation, not the covering. Covering is meningitis and brain tissue itself is encephalitis. If it is in the cerebrum, we say cerebral encephalitis. Here you see those layers give the protection to the brain. So this is the brain here, and these are the structures. So meninges has 3 layers. Dura mater is the strongest and toughest one, thickest one. Arachnoid mater is the middle one. Under the arachnoid, in subarachnoid space, you have the cerebrospinal fluid and blood vessels. And pia mater is the thinnest one and the innermost one that is attached to the surface of the, tightly attached to the surface of the brain. It's difficult to separate, I mentioned. Ventricles in the brain. Inside the brain, you have fluid filled cavities. Those are called the ventricles. Now, inside the human brain, there are 2 C-shaped lateral ventricles, 1 third ventricle and 1 fourth ventricle. Now, these ventricles are connected to each other. And this is the brain. This is the lateral ventricle in one half of the brain. In other half, you have another ventricle, lateral ventricle. So there are 2 lateral ventricles. And inside the ventricle, you have cerebrospinal fluid, okay, CSF. So ventricles are ventricle contains cerebrospinal fluid inside. And from where that cerebrospinal fluid comes, cerebrospinal fluid is secreted from a capillary structure attached to the roof of the ventricle or ceiling of the ventricle, and that is called choroid plexus. It is a capillary plexus that continuously secretes cerebrospinal fluid into the ventricles. Okay. Now, how the ventricles are located? Where inside the brain? This is the front view. So if you can see inside the brain from the front, actually you cannot, but if you can, then inside the brain, the lateral ventricles are located like this. From the front, if you can see inside the brain. So these two are lateral ventricles, and your third ventricle is this one, third ventricle. Okay, and then the fourth ventricle is here. Now you see how they are connected. Lateral ventricles are connected to the third ventricle by the interventricular foramen. Okay, if you see from the side, these two are lateral ventricles, and the third ventricle is here, and the fourth ventricle is located here. So you see the lateral ventricle is connected to the third ventricle, and this is called the interventricular foramen. Here, these two interventricular foramen. So the fluid can go from the lateral ventricle to third or third ventricle to lateral. And third and fourth ventricles are connected by this passage, and this is called the cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct here. Now, if any tumor is formed around the ventricles, for example, if any brain tumor is formed here, then what will happen? This tumor will press the interventricular foramen here and will block the interventricular foramen. So what will happen? The fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, will not be able to get out from the lateral ventricle and will start to accumulate. So the fluid pressure will increase. The amount of cerebrospinal fluid will increase inside the ventricles, right? And that will increase the pressure as well as the size of the brain, because the size of the ventricles will be enlarged, will get bigger. And that condition is called the hydro means water, so fluid or water accumulates inside the ventricle. So hydrocephalus. You know, hydro is water and cephalic part is the head part. So water in the head in shortcut. Okay, so now you know that in infants, newborn babies, the cranial bones are not yet attached to each other. That's why you can see that the skull moves, because the bones are not yet attached to each other. There are membranes between the growing bones. For example, this is one growing bone, this is another piece, and there is membrane here, soft membrane, which is not yet uh, bone. So what happens when the size of the brain gets bigger, the bones can move away from each other, and the size of the head can get big. Okay, and you can easily see that the size of the head of the infant is pretty big, bigger than normal size, and that can happen because of the uh, membranes between the cranial bones. They are not yet fused, and these areas are called fontanelles. And in adult person, when the cranial bones are already fused, attached to each other by sutures, you have learned about that. Sutures are very strong joints, so the bones cannot move, strongly attached to each other, so the size of the head cannot get bigger. However, the pressure inside the brain is increasing, so that is even more dangerous than the infants, because in infants the head can get bigger to absorb some pressure or accommodate the size, but in case of adult person it cannot happen. So intracranial pressure will go up very high. If you can drain the cerebrospinal fluid out from the ventricle by inserting cannula, you can take the fluid out, then the pressure will go down. Of course, if there is a tumor, you have to surgically remove that. That will release the reduce the pressure. Okay, so those are the ventricles. So cord plexus attached to the roof of the ventricles secrete the cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid uh, gives bouncy to the central nervous system organs. Cerebrospinal fluid is located around the brain as well as around the spinal cord in subarachnoid space. Okay, so both organs are protected by the cerebrospinal fluid, and this fluid really protects your brain and the spinal cord when you suddenly move your body or head. If you suddenly push the brake of your car suddenly stops, your body shakes suddenly, your head moves suddenly, and because of that fluid around the brain and the spinal cord, the soft brain won't hit the hard skull, so prevents the damage. When you ride roller coaster in Six Flags, the roller coaster moves suddenly from one direction to another. Because of the cerebrospinal fluid, your brain doesn't hit the skull. So that is another important function. And cerebrospinal fluid has some nutrients and chemicals that also keeps the brain healthy. Here you see the choroid plexus, that capillary plexus secretes the cerebrospinal fluid, and the cerebrospinal fluid from the ventricles you see go to the subarachnoid space. This is the subarachnoid space. So from the ventricles, the fluid this way, there are apertures or openings. Fluid goes to the subarachnoid space, and also in subarachnoid space around the spinal cord here. Okay, so you have cerebrospinal fluid around the brain and the spinal cord, where in the subarachnoid space, and it circulates continuously, moving. Okay, this is your fourth ventricle here, and you see the choroid plexus, and the third ventricle is here, third ventricle, and lateral ventricle here. Now we'll see the parts of the brain. The largest structure of the brain, that if you see the brain, the largest part you see first at a glance, that is the cerebrum. Now uh, cerebrum is the largest structure of the brain. Cerebrum consists of two halves called the hemispheres. So this is one hemisphere and this is another half, another hemisphere. Okay, and two hemispheres are separated by longitudinal fissure. So this is one hemisphere and this is another hemisphere. So cerebrum consists of right and left hemisphere. Hemi means half. Hemisphere. So two hemispheres together form the cerebrum. Okay, and that is the largest part of the brain. Now, next is the diencephalon. Diencephalon consists of the following structures: thalamus, hypo, under the thalamus, below the thalamus, you have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Which is the master gland, you know that. So these structures belong to the diencephalon, and most part of the diencephalon is inside the brain. Thalamus, hypothalamus, these are located inside. You don't see from outside. Then brainstem. Brainstem is the part that is attached to the lower part of the brain under the cerebrum, and it has three structures in the brainstem. You have the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So midbrain here, pons here, and then medulla oblongata. So those are three parts of the brainstem. And then behind and below the cerebrum, so just posterior inferior of the cerebrum, you have another structure. Clearly you can see in the back side of the brain, that is called the cerebellum. And cerebellum is a very important organ or part of the structure or part of the brain. Now, if I just briefly mention the functions of these structures, you know that your brain performs so many functions. We cannot, discuss all those functions. Just briefly, if I want to say, cerebral hemisphere, the outer part of the cerebrum. So this is the cerebrum, and the outer layer or part of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex, okay. So this part, and in the cerebral cortex you have many functional areas. Many important functional areas are located in the cerebral cortex. That means the surface of the cerebrum. If this is the back, for example, this area is the visual cortex. That means it processes the vision, sight. You have auditory cortex. You have somatosensory cortex that gives you the sensation of pain, touch, temperature. You have motor cortices. So many functional areas. Some areas are motor areas, some areas are sensory areas. So visual area, sensory areas. Just know that the cerebral hemisphere uh, contains many functional areas in the cortex. Diencephalon, thalamus. Thalamus is called the major sensory relay station. Major sensory relay station. Why? Because almost all sensory signals are processed in the thalamus. There are exceptions, but almost all of the sensory signals that before going to the cerebrum, they are processed in the thalamus. Then another part of diencephalon, hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is another very important structure located below the thalamus. Few are controls the pituitary gland, controls pituitary. So master gland is controlled by the hypothalamus, right? So it is the boss of the pituitary or master. Then food and water intake. How much food and water your body needs, that is controlled by the hypothalamus. You know that when you are thirsty, you feel that you would drink a lot, right? A lot of water. Then you start drinking, and at one point, even if someone asks you to drink more, you will say no. Why? Because your body, when your body gets required amount of water, then inhibition comes from the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus can detect that, the concentration of the body fluid. So it can detect the amount of water and will inhibit your mind or demand of uh, water intake. Same thing for food. When you are hungry, you think that you will eat a lot. You start, to eat, and then at one point you lose the interest. You stop. You don't eat anymore. So that is controlled by the hypothalamus. It can watch the amount of water and nutrients in the body fluid. So that is another important function. There is a clinical condition, hypothalamic disorder. In that condition, the patient doesn't know when to stop eating or drinking. So they do eat a lot and get the body gets bigger, obese. Another function is temperature regulation, regulation of body temperature. Okay. So those are a few important functions of the hypothalamus. Then pituitary gland, you know that it is called the master gland. So pituitary is the master gland. It regulates other endocrine glands of the body. However, the pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus. Brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla. Brainstem regulates or controls the reflexes, important reflexes of the body. It controls the heart rate, heart function, respiratory rate or respiration, so breathing, heart function, those are controlled by the reflexes. Sneeze, reflex. Okay, so there are reflex centers, and these centers control the heart function and respiration. So those very two important functions of your body are regulated or controlled by the brainstem. So if damage occurs in the brainstem here, if this part is damaged, then the heart function and breathing can be stopped and the person may die immediately. Cerebellum. Cerebellum, in one sentence you can say that controls the balance of the body and equilibrium. So balance and equilibrium. So those are the important parts of the brain, different parts of the brain and their functions. Here you see the cerebrum, the largest part. This is one side, so this is a hemisphere, and then this is thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary. So this is the diencephalon. This is cerebral hemisphere. And then in the posterior inferior part of the brain, you have the cerebellum, and this is green colored. That's the brain stem. First part is called the midbrain here. Then this round part is the pons, and this is the medulla oblongata. And then the spinal cord is here. In each hemisphere, you have 4 lobes or 4 parts. This red colored area is called the frontal lobe in the front, mostly covered by the frontal bone. And then behind that, you have the parietal lobe, this one, and mostly covered by the parietal bone. And below the frontal and parietal, this is the temporal lobe, mainly under the temporal bone. And in the back, you have the occipital lobe, all the way in the back and mostly covered by the occipital bone. Now, if you see the surface of the cerebrum, you can see here that many grooves, these shallow grooves, are called sulci. Sulci is plural. There are many, right? Shallow grooves, like this is one, this is one. So these shallow grooves on the surface of the cerebrum are called sulci. Sulcus is singular. If I say sulcus, that is one. Okay, and sulci, many. Some people say sulci, that is also correct. Now, between two sulci, the ridges. So between the sulci, the ridges are called gyri. This is also plural. Singular is gyrus. Some people say gyri. That is not incorrect. Okay, so you see on the surface you have the grooves, sulci, and the ridges between the grooves called gyri. Uh, Now, there are also deep grooves, not shallow, and those there are few only, and deep grooves are called fissures. For example, I told you between two hemispheres, like they're separated, two hemispheres are separated by a fissure, deep groove or cut, that is called longitudinal fissure. Also, between the cerebrum and cerebellum, you have a groove, a deep groove here, and that is called transverse fissure. Longitudinal fissure you don't see here because you are seeing from the side. It is between two hubs, two hemispheres. Now, if you cut a small piece of the cerebrum and see, it looks like a pastry or a piece of cake. I mentioned you before that outer surface is called the cortex. So you see the cortex, and inner part is the white matter. Now the cortex is gray matter. Why? In the cortex you have all the cell bodies of the neurons. I explained that in my last lecture, where you have the cell bodies, many cell bodies together, that area looks gray. Inside the cell bodies you have the Nissl granules, you know that. So cell bodies and dendrites are here in the gray matter, and this part is white because the axons from those cell bodies enter here, and the axons are covered by myelin sheath, insulation, white. That's why this area is white. Okay, and functional areas are in the outer layer in the cortex. So the four lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. Now, if you open the lateral sulcus, there is a groove here that is called the lateral sulcus. Let's go back here. This one is lateral sulcus. If you open uh, uh, the lateral sulcus, what you will see a hidden area there, and that area is called insula. And why insula is important? You have taste cortex or taste area cortex in that insula. So the food you eat, the taste is processed mostly here in the insula. Now I told you that cerebrum has many functional areas on the surface or cortex. In all the way in the back, this area is called the primary visual cortex, the main visual area that first receives the signal from your eyes. That's why called the primary. Okay, and around here you have other visual areas called the visual association areas. So from primary the signal goes to the other visual areas. Then this sulcus is important. Why? Because this is, you see, separating the frontal lobe and parietal lobe, and this sulcus is called the central sulcus. This one is an important sulcus. And in front of the sulcus, central sulcus, that means in the back part of the frontal lobe, this gyrus is called the primary motor cortex or precentral gyrus. Precentral, that means before the central sulcus. Gyrus, singular, right? One. So this red is precentral, before the central sulcus, and it is actually primary motor cortex. That means your movement of the skeletal muscles or body movements are mostly controlled by this area, this cortex. That's why called the primary motor movement. And behind the central sulcus, this is called the post-central gyrus. Post is after. Post-central gyrus. And this one is very important too. Why? Because this gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex. That means the pain, touch, temperature, all those signals are processed, come here and first processed here. So this is primary motor, controls the movement, and this is primary somatosensory, controls the somatosensations such as pain, touch, temperature. Those signals are processed in this post-central gyrus. This area in the middle of the frontal lobe is called the Broca's area. This area was named after a French neurologist whose name was Dr. Broca's. He had a patient who suffered from stroke, and after his stroke he had difficulty in production of speech, and after the death of his patient he discovered that this region in the frontal lobe got lesion or damaged, and Dr. Broca's first proposed that this area in the frontal lobe is responsible for the production of speech, and uh, this area was named after Dr. Broca's, and this area is the Broca's area responsible for the speech production, and any lesion in this area would cause the difficulty in production of speech, but the person will be able to recognize another person's speech. Okay, so it is in the middle of the frontal lobe. Now there is another area which is located partly in the lower part of the parietal lobe and partly in the temporal lobe. You can see within this dotted line, this area is called the Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area is responsible for the recognition of speech or speech recognition. So Broca's is responsible for speech production, and Wernicke's is responsible for recognition of speech. So any lesion in Wernicke's area would cause the problem to understand what another person is saying, but the person, since the Broca's area is intact, the person will be able to produce speech, but the difficulty will be in understanding what another person is saying. Makes sense? And then this area, which is located in the upper part of the temporal lobe, on the bank of the lateral sulcus, okay, near the bank of the lateral sulcus, this area is called the primary auditory cortex. That means the sound signal from your ear arrives here and processed in this area, and that's why it is called the primary auditory cortex. Okay. So those are some important functional areas in the cerebrum. Now, as a whole, if I talk about the function of the frontal lobe as a whole, this part is much bigger in human brain, frontal lobe. Why? Because this area processes higher brain functions. That, distinguishes a human from other creatures, separates human brain function from other creatures. What are the higher brain functions? Your logic, rational, your ability to analyze, problem solving, doing math, right? Those are higher brain functions. Creativity, innovation, okay? Those functions belong to the higher functions and mostly controlled by the frontal area. So, the important sensory areas are these areas. You have primary somatosensory for pain, touch, temperature, pain, touch, temperature. Those are processed here first, primary somatosensations. Association areas, from primary, the signal goes to the association areas, and association areas combine, associate different functions together. That's why they are called association. Two or more modalities are combined together to give you the perception. Like when you touch a piece of ice, you know, your the temperature is processed separately, the shape of the ice, piece of ice, texture, right, the surface, all those are processed separately. Then in the association areas, they are combined together to give you the perception that it is a piece of ice. uh, Sensory, important sensory areas. Motor areas, I gave you the example before, primary motor cortex, primary motor cortex, right, that controls the body movement, skeletal muscles of the body. Broca's area is also a motor area, Broca's, because it sends signal to the vocal cord and controls the vocal cord. So these are motor areas, and motor areas control the voluntary movement of the vocal cord or the skeletal muscles of the body. Sensory areas, as I have mentioned, your visual, auditory, gustatory, olfactory, those are sensory areas, primary somatosensory. Association areas where two or more functions or modalities are combined. I gave you the example that when you touch a piece of ice without seeing it, you can tell that this is a piece of ice because the texture, the temperature, right, the shape, all those are processed separately. Then in the association areas, those are combined together, put together. Okay. Another good example would be like when you are watching a lecture, you see that person, right? See the person moving hands and mouth, uh, and at the same time you listen the lecture. Now you must remember in the cerebrum, your visual area is in the back. This is visual, and auditory is near the lateral sulcus here. This is the auditory. So you see that when you are simultaneously at the same time you are listening, so the signal from your ear uh, is going to the auditory cortex here, and from your eyes the signal is going to the visual areas. But those two things must be combined together, right, to give you the perception. If you are listening me and see that someone else is moving the mouth or hands, that would be odd, right? So those two things are processed separately first, but they must be combined to make sense that this person is moving and the sound is coming from the same person, right? So that is the important function of the association areas. In the brainstem, if you make a section here or in the spinal cord here, the outer part is the white matter and inner part is the gray matter. Okay, this is spinal cord here. Inner part is gray matter, outer part is white matter. Okay, in the cerebrum, I mentioned before, the outer is gray matter and inner is the white matter. This structure, you see, is called the corpus callosum, and corpus callosum connects two hemispheres, hold the hemispheres together, and this is a thick band-like structure, and through which many fibers go from one hemisphere to the other. So the fibers pass from one hemisphere to the other through the corpus callosum. And you understand that two hemispheres must talk to each other, because, for example, you have visual area here in your right hemisphere. Also, you have visual area in your left hemisphere in the same area. And from your right eye, signal goes to the left side's hemisphere, and from your left eye, signal goes to the right side's hemisphere. The same. And these two areas must talk to each other to give you the entire visual field, right? So the fibers from the visual cortices go from one hemisphere to another through the corpus callosum. So all corresponding areas of two hemispheres are talking to each other through the fibers passing through the corpus callosum. The life of that patient, and that is called callosectomy, splitting the corpus callosum or dissecting the corpus callosum. In your primary somatosensory and primary motor, this is red area is the primary motor cortex, precentral gyrus, and this is primary somatosensory, the blue one. And in this hemisphere, you have the same primary motor, primary somatosensory. And in these areas, primary motor and primary somatosensory, you have the map of your whole body. So if I just take this primary somatosensory cortex and map that which area is receiving signal from which part of the body, if I just do the mapping by recording that which area is receiving signal, pain touch signal from which part of the body, uh, you will find that this is a use the hand much more than other parts of the body to touch or feel the pain, temperature, the temperature, those proportionate to actual size of the body. That's why we say disproportionate. Disproportional map, okay, body map in the brain. In the primary somatosensory and primary motor cortex, and those are called homunculi. So you have same map in the motor cortex, in the red area here, primary motor cortex. So we move our hands a lot, motor movement, right? That's why bigger area. We move the mouth a lot, that's why this area is very big, okay?